everyone to this evening's lecture on Kastro Apalirou, Naxos, Insights into the Early Byzantine Aegean in an Age of Resilience. We are very happy tonight to have with us the researchers responsible for this project that is run at Naxos. It's a collaboration between the Norwegian Institute and the Apalirou. The researchers who will speak tonight is first James Crow, who is a professor of classical archaeology at the University of Edinburgh. And his research focuses on the archaeology of settlement and frontiers. Over 30 years, his fieldwork and studies have ranged from Hadrian's Wall in Britain to the Eastern Mediterranean and in particular Greece and Turkey, from Roman to later medieval times. Recently he has focused on Byzantine urban and landscape archaeology, and especially the water supply of Constantinople and on the coastal regions of the Black Sea and the Aegean. We also have with us Professor Sam Turner from Newcastle University, who is a landscape archaeologist. He does research on historical landscapes from ancient times to the present day. He is currently involved in projects in the UK, France, Spain, Italy, Greece and Turkey. And then we have also with us tonight Knut Ødegård from the University of Oslo. He is also my predecessor in this position. He was director of the Norwegian Institute from 2000 to 2005, wasn't it?
2007.
Okay, sorry. It's a long time ago. He has been conducting archaeological research at Aegean in Arcadia, and now at Naxos in the Cyclades. So this will be, I would love to say this will be some kind of Platonic dialogue, but I think that they will speak one after one, and according to my information, James Crow will start out. So you do it the way you have arranged it, but I certainly, for one, look forward to hearing about the Dark Age as interpreted by historians and archaeologists. So please.
Right, thank you very much for the introduction. And thank you for the Norwegian Institute for hosting the meeting this evening, and also for our collaboration with the Norwegian Institute, that's Sam Turner and myself, which has been successfully being carried on for the last 4 or 5 years. What we're hoping to do this evening is to try and present some of the results of the research, partly from the Norwegian side of the project and partly from some of my own side of the project. Some of my own side of the project is the Apalirou Environs project, because we are concerned with the area around Kastro Apalirou, which you can see on the right. It's the high peak, and Knut will talk about that shortly. Thank you very much. And this is the sort of traffic jam going to work in the morning. Not every morning, you have to time your travel quite closely, but they do let these goats out, and on this occasion it produced quite a good photograph. And then Sam and I will talk about what's happening in the environs around, both in a wider distance away from the Kastro in southern Naxos and on the immediate slopes. Now, I think titles, we heard the word Dark Age in Euron's introduction, and Dark Age is becoming slightly unfashionable these days, and I think quite rightly so. And I prefer early medieval, early Byzantine to describe the period. But it is that period after the classical age, after 600, when the Byzantine Empire came under greater challenges, that's a sort of the polite word that one uses these days, but remained, and some of you may be aware of John Halden's book, The Empire That Would Not Die, a very strange title, I think, but talking specifically about the period from 650 up to 750, that era. And as we shall hear, the significance of Apalirou and the area that we're working in is there situated. I'd like to start, however, by just drawing a comparison and recognizing the significance of the Aegean Islands to what's happening in the wider Eastern Roman world in the 6th and through into the 7th and 8th centuries. Initially, I just want to draw your attention to the island of Karpathos, which is down here, in the very strategic position between Rhodes and Crete. And then we'll turn on to Naxos. But it's very interesting from this recent publication by George Delianakis, who's published his Oxford thesis on the Dodecanese and Eastern Aegean Islands in late antiquity, that the island of Karpathos reflects not just the events or the situation in the immediate area of its islands, but represents what's happening in the empire at large. Because the Carpathians, as they're referred to in the text, the mariners of Karpathos and the mariners of Alexandria were responsible for the transmission of the grain annona from Alexandria and Egypt to Constantinople, which was able to sustain the new megalopolis of late antiquity. And the consequences of that on Karpathos are very significant. And Delianakis has made this very clear in his publication. But I think it's important just to see how external factors can influence and can be recognized in terms of the material record. And this one church which I show, one basilica, which has a tiled floor, unlike several of the other basilicas on Karpathos which have mosaic floors, very rich mosaic floors, but it does have Proconnesian marble probably dating to the first part of the 6th century, Proconnesian marble screens and columns and capitals, all of which of course comes from Constantinople and is the very most expensive way of decorating your church in the 6th century. So in other words, the consequences of that trade, the benefits of that trade for the island can be seen to be expressed in terms of the archaeological record, where there are something like 23 basilicas on that island alone and another 6 or 7 early Christian basilicas on adjacent islands. If we move to Naxos, into the period of the early medieval period, we don't see the same phenomenon. We don't see sort of richness expressed, but we do see a luxury of churches, something that Klimis Aslanidis, who's in the audience this evening, has published in his University of Patras doctorate. And there are such a large number of churches on the island of the medieval period, and I think quite reasonably can be dated to the early medieval period, that something clearly significant and distinctive is happening on this island, which in late antiquity, in the early Christian era, has basilicas, but they don't reflect the same richness that we see on somewhere like Karpathos. So in terms of connectivity, Karpathos is right in the centre of things. It's on the great trunk route from Alexandria, but Naxos is just a successful island within the Cyclades. But within a century and a half, it becomes the focus then, or expresses activity which is not to be seen elsewhere in the Aegean, and certainly not recognised so easily elsewhere in what remains of the Eastern Roman Byzantine Empire in Asia Minor and on the coastlands of Greece and into Sicily. So this is Klimis's map, which is going to be in our forthcoming publication, which is based on the conference which we held in 2014, which was hosted by the Norwegian Institute in Naxos, and it shows the distribution of churches, some of which are from the earlier period and some of which are a little bit later, but basically all those churches belong to the period before 1200. And you can see that whereas this is one particularly interesting church, it doesn't have decoration, so it doesn't achieve the attention that many of the churches do. Isidoros, near to Kalki, and there you can see the form of a rather less expensive form of decoration within the church. But our attention really is towards the southern end of the island, and it's towards Kastro Apalirou, and here you can see the Kastro, and this is what Knut will be talking about, but more significantly, in the foreground, on the flanks of the hills, just away from, you see one of the most important, if not the most significant, of all the aniconic decorated churches on the island, of which there are perhaps 23. There's a second discussion about exactly how many. And these have been published variously as a consequence of all the activities of the Eforia going back to the 1960s, which saw a great attention at conserving the monuments, and of course the recent conservation Kiriaki in the north of the island. This is the laser scan of the interior of St. John Theologian Apalirou, which was carried out by Sam Turner and Alex Turner. And this is the decoration, the really complex aniconic decoration which we find within the Naxos churches. And although there still remains a dispute amongst art historians and archaeologists about the chronology of these, I think in general the tendency is now to recognise that these do belong to the period, if not exactly reflecting iconoclasm, certainly of that period belonging to the later 8th and into the 9th and perhaps a little later centuries. Now, at that point, I now hand over to my colleague Knut, who will say something about the great fortress that overlooks that church.
Thank you, Jim. And I will be speaking about Kastro Apalirou, where we have been working for quite some years. We started in 2010, as I will say a little bit more about later. But of course, the interesting thing about Naxos is, of course, the change in the infrastructure and the settlement during these, well, dark ages, even though you didn't want to use the term, Jim, from the sort of the old capital of Naxos, which is at Hora, as you know, to the southern part, interior part of Naxos at Kastro Apalirou. We of course don't really know whether Kastro Apalirou could be termed the capital of Naxos, but it certainly was one of the most important centers of Naxos during, from the 7th century until the early 13th century. So this is what I'm going to talk about, and it's strikingly, as has been termed quite recently in the publication, a strikingly introvert choice. I mean, why do you exchange a sort of a good, well, fairly good harbor, well, at least certainly at the coast, with something which is in the interior and which is not easily communicated with, because Kastro Apalirou is on top of that mountain over there. But it does correspond to the changes that we have, that we know happened in exactly this period, and which is very nicely summed up by Syrianus Magister, probably from the 9th century, in this quote. And I won't say it all, but as he says in the later part here, as for us, taking account of the uncertainty of future events and deeming security to be more important than beauty, we prefer to build and fortify them. I guess. I will cross this off my list. Good. We prefer to build and fortify them on such sites where the machines of besiegers become useless. And actually, Kastro Apalirou is a brilliant example of exactly this. It is a site that is very particular in many, and I know many of you have been there, so you know what I'm talking about. Now, Kastro Apalirou obviously is not a new site. It's been known, well, always. Of course, on Naxos, the inhabitants have known Kastro Apalirou always, because well, the ruins on Apalirou has been visible always, and there are myths, there are stories told about Kastro Apalirou, so it's nothing. I mean, this is not a site that has been sort of found by us or anyone else. It's always been known. But on the other hand, it has not been studied properly. I mean, a few references here and there, and I included this from 1915 in English work by Fotheringham on Lycosan Nudon, where he says, quite correctly, a careful study of the remains of Kastro Apalirou is clearly a task which might repay the archaeologist. But strangely enough, it hasn't really been the focus of any work up till about 2010, when we started work on mapping of Kastro Apalirou. As I said, not a new site, known for quite a long time, and known even among archaeologists, but no proper documentation existed until quite recently. And of course, the first task that we had when we started work here with a small Norwegian team in 2010 was simply to document the standing remains, obviously. And we did that with rather traditional techniques of the total station, and here are my colleagues David Hill and Håkon Roland documenting the fortifications of Kastro Apalirou with exactly this equipment, and of course supplementing with mapping work on the computer afterwards. And we departed from a rather simple plan in 2010, and as you can see, the plan steadily sort of augmented with new structures during 2011, 12 and 13 until we reach about that result. And I will say a little bit more about the different type of structures and buildings we have inside the Kastro Apalirou. This is how we interpret the map now. I should say that this is not all the structures on Kastro Apalirou, but it is the structures that we can sort of interpret as belonging to a building. That means that there are, I mean, structures that we know are there, but that we can't connect to a building as yet. But of course, we will augment this map, obviously, in the years to come. But this is at least where we are at the moment. And as I will try to show, this is a rather complex new town, and we are quite certain, as I will show, that it is from the 7th century AD. Now we have, of course, the fortifications of Kastro Apalirou, the line of walls that I will speak a little bit more about later. We have around 50 cisterns inside the walls. We have more than 60 houses documented so far, and we know that there are more than the 60. And we have 2 churches inside the walls, one large church complex and one smaller, and I will speak a little bit more about the small church later. And we even have a bath, a hypocostal bath near the main church of Kastro Apalirou. So we have quite a number of structures inside the town. Now the fortifications are rather simple, as you can see. Not very many towers, only one proper gate, and as I said, not the sort of, you know, the most advanced type of fortification one could think of. But on the other hand, that was not needed because it was on top of a hill, a very steep hill. So you didn't really need the sort of very elaborate fortifications at Kastro Apalirou because, I mean, the site itself is so easily defendable. And the fortifications is, as you can see here, more or less, and road is 160, I think, in length. And it's easy to follow more or less all around the top of the mountain. Now we know that there are at least 2 phases in the fortifications. This northern bastion, which is very easy to see when you come or when you climb up to the site, is clearly an addition, a later addition. We don't know exactly when, but it's clearly a later addition to the circuit of walls. And we believe that the original wall probably went a little bit further in here, and then they added at a certain stage this later phase with the circular bastion. As I said, we have about 50 cisterns, and they are important because water is of course essential at a site like this. There are no wells, there are no possibility of collecting water other than collecting rainwater. So cisterns is very essential, and the number of cisterns is important because it shows that this was not just a garrison or anything like that. It was a town built to support a much larger population. Some of them are big, some of them are small. I will speak a little bit more about that. But I will first say something about how we date Kastro Apalirou. And of course, what Jim presented here is of course the sort of the historical situation where we can quite easily posit the foundation of Kastro Apalirou, and it has always been held to be somewhere between the 6th and the 8th century. But we do have a little bit more of proper archaeological dating of Kastro Apalirou, and that came from the very small excavation, and given where this site is on top of a mountain, which it takes about 40 minutes to climb up to, it's quite obvious that large-scale excavation is very difficult. But we did a small excavation at this small church. It's a small double-aisled church, and you can see one of the aisles here. The other one is next to it. And it was interesting because we did get an idea. We didn't excavate the whole thing. We excavated most of the northern aisle of the church, or the chapel, or whatever you should call it. And that was basically to obtain some more material for dating. And in that respect it was extremely interesting because we could see that there was included in the building pottery that could be rather nicely dated, and which was evidently a part of the building, I mean, because it had mortar and things like that. And that was, for instance, pottery like this, a Spartan III emperor, mid-6th to 7th century in date, which should date this building, as I said, probably somewhere in the 7th century. And on the floor level we had pottery and glass from the 11th, 12th century, which shows sort of the end of occupation, more or less, of this church. So it has a lifespan between the 7th and, let's say, late 11th, 12th century, something like that, which fits very nicely into the sort of historical picture, because we know that Kastro Apalirou was taken by Marco Sanudo after the Fourth Crusade, and that seems to be confirmed by what we have from this small church of Kastro Apalirou. So we do have a little bit of actual archaeological evidence for dating Kastro Apalirou to the 7th century. Now, I wanted to say something about the structure, the complexity of this town. But of course, and I might be too basic here because there are quite a number of Byzantine scholars here. But of course, when we are talking about urbanistics and the Byzantine period, one problem that we always have is, or I at least get these questions from the audience, that, well, it doesn't look very planned, does it, the town? But of course, that's mainly because we have this sort of, as I say here, the curse of the ancient cities. I mean, we have this sort of tradition of the orthogonal planning in antiquity, like Piraeus here, for instance, in Höpfner and Schwantener's reconstruction, or this quarter in the same publication. These orthogonal, fantastic, regular towns. But we often forget to think about that this was made in a quite peculiar political and economic situation. I mean, Greek town planning did depart from colonial foundations like this at Metaponto in Italy, for instance, where the important thing was to assign lots to each colonist, and which of course made for a very regular town planning because it was practical. It was the only way of allotting, the parts for each and single colonist. Of course, late antique and Byzantine town planning is completely different. And we often have a tendency, and it's a sort of art historical tendency, to look at urbanistics and urbanistic patterns as a sort of design. But of course it's not a design. I mean, it is something created because it corresponds to certain values or some needs of the community. And of course the communities of late antiquity or early Byzantine period were completely different from, let's say, Greek colonial foundations in Italy in the 7th or 6th century BC. And we can have a glimpse, and I'm not taking the whole urbanistic history here, but we can have a glimpse of what sort of the urbanistics of late antiquity was like by looking at sort of model cities like Justiniana Prima or Kaliningrad in Serbia, which clearly shows the sort of hierarchical pattern in late antique cities with clear areas for church, for administration, for the military, for the merchants, for the artisans, etc., which is very clear here at Kaliningrad, where each group inside the community had their own area, more or less, and this of course created a sort of quite different town from in earlier antiquity. Now, how does Kastro Apalirou sort of fit into this picture? Well, it's strange to think that Kaliningrad or Justiniana Prima is only about 100 years earlier than Kastro Apalirou. But Kastro Apalirou is very different, and it's very much simpler. We do see some patterns that are continued at Kastro Apalirou, but there are also very many differences. Now, first of all, and Sam is going to talk a bit about this later, first of all we need to say that Kastro Apalirou on top here was not the only settlement in this area. We know that there was also a lower settlement, not fortified, but quite a substantial settlement. So we do have this situation of an upper town with fortifications and a lower town without fortifications. That's important in this respect. And of course, this might seem, sort of disordered, at least compared to Piraeus and the other ancient cities I have talked about. But there are, in fact, a few principles guiding this settlement and the planning of it. First of all, this is a town made for with some sort of difference. I talked about the cisterns, and we do have a cluster of large and probably public cisterns in this part, and more private cisterns in houses in this part of the town. So there's clearly some sort of difference between the northern end and the rest. Now, we do have indications that this was a sort of public area inside the town. First of all, the most important church, the Aios Yorgos complex here, a large number of cisterns, no houses, as far as we know at least. So this seems to be a sort of public center inside Kastro Apalirou. Perhaps, we are not quite sure about that, but we do believe that there is a sort of monumental entrance into the area here through two big cisterns in this area. So everything points to this being the sort of the administrative religious center of Kastro Apalirou. Now, as I said, this is also a town that is made for not only people but for creatures like this. I mean, it's evidently not made for carts. It's made for donkeys and mules, which explains that there are quite a few sharp angles here, which is quite okay for a donkey. It's not okay for a cart. So there are a few sort of things to think about when you are considering a town like this compared to the earlier orthogonal towns. We can see some of the complexity when it comes to collecting the water, because we have noticed that we have a pattern of streets here following terraces, and most of these houses are situated on terraces because the terrain is rather steep. But we also have stairways connecting the different levels in the town. And interestingly enough, that along almost all these staircases, we have a system of drains collecting water from the houses along the stairways, and also indications that there are drains that go north-south, which probably collected this water into the big public systems in the northern part of the town. So this is one example of what we term the complexity of Kastro Apalirou. It's not complex in the same way as earlier towns was, but it was complex in its kind in this particular situation on top of the mountain. We also have a variety of domestic structures, and some of them are interesting. For instance, just inside the one gate giving access to Kastro Apalirou, and particularly perhaps these houses in this area, which are could even have defensive purposes because they are right inside the gate, but also they were some of the first structures you would actually see when you came into the town. So they are really very visible, very clearly seen, and would probably belong to important families, important figures inside the community of Kastro Apalirou. So there's quite a lot to sort of to go into when you go into details in the structure of Kastro Apalirou. But as I said, the most important thing here is that we have a sort of indication of a public area and the domestic area. But of course, at Kastro Apalirou, the really significant difference is whether you live inside the walls or outside the walls. That's the most important distinction we can see at Kastro Apalirou. And at this point, I think it's proper to give the word to you, Sam, for the area outside Kastro Apalirou. Yep.
Okay, thanks, Knut. So we have Kimi's map of churches, and one of the reasons that it's so interesting for us to be able to collaborate on this project with the IFRI and the Norwegian Institute is because it gives us the opportunity to try to explore, think about the character of this landscape and its development in the early Middle Ages. The simple kind of wealth of the quantity of churches is brought out if we look at this is the view looking southeast across the central plain of the Rimalia of Naxos. So the village of Filoti is 2.5 kilometers roughly in the distance, and in between the viewpoint, which is the church of Taxiarchis here, there are all of these churches of the early Middle Ages. So an incredible density of structures. And Jim and I first visited Naxos, Jim Crow and I first visited Naxos in 2006. And we're really struck by this, and also by the question of not knowing what the context of these churches was, not understanding, you know, whether they were originally founded in settlements or by whom they were founded or what the context in the landscape was. And we undertook a GIS-based study to try and map in simple terms some of the cultural features of the cultural landscape. So terraces and walls and different types of landscape resources, so fields with olives and rough grazing land, which, you know, enabled us to see certain patterns. So some churches are located on the edges of the systems of fields and terraces, but not really to address the question of chronology and understand the dating. And so, as I said, the opportunity to collaborate on the Apalirou project has enabled us to start thinking about the broader landscape context of the site at Kastro Apalirou, and also buildings in the landscape around it. So that the area on the screen is a large study area, which is probably impossible to study the whole thing in a lifetime. But we've been working over the last 3 years in this area here, in the southern part of this study area, principally. And this is again the church of Aegean at Apalirou. And so thinking about the context of these churches, the first methodology that we've used is intensive field walking survey, pedestrian survey. So the church is just here, and our method for field walking survey is based on the method developed over many years, but the one used by Andy Bevan on the island of Kastro. And we've been walking in 10-meter grids, collecting ceramics in 10-meter grid. And this is just these are 10-meter squares around this church. To then identify the ceramics and be able to plot out the distributions of finds around the churches. We started in 2015, and we started with survey on the area immediately to the west of Kastro Apalirou. So here's the Kastro, and here is the mountainside to the west. And in 2016 we field walked the area to the north of that. And from this area, which these are 100-meter squares, which doesn't look that enormous, we recovered 23,000 shards of ceramics, which is a lot of ceramics, especially if you have to carry it off this mountain, which I feel like I personally carried quite a lot of it. My colleague Joe Skinner from Newcastle carried the other half. No, it's quite hard work going up the mountain with many kilos of ceramics. This is these are prominent members of the pot team. So this is Mark Jackson from Newcastle and Maria Duggan from Newcastle, and they've been collaborating with Claire Diamanti from the FRE, and with Rosanna Valente from Edinburgh University, and Halvard Ingjerd from currently St Andrews University in Scotland, to analyse the ceramics which have been recovered from the mountainside. And this is just plotted onto the photograph, but some of the there's dense scatters of ceramics from the top of the mountain, the area of the Kastro, below on the mountainside, and other scatters in this area. And one of the most, it's a very interesting assemblage, because my pot colleagues tell me that it's quite distinctive, especially from the mountainside around the Kastro. We have a relatively limited range of chronological range of fabrics represented on the mountainside. On the top of the mountain, the ceramics date from the 7th century through perhaps to the 12th or maybe early 13th century. And on the lower mountainside, the ceramics date from the 7th century through to the 9th or possibly 10th century. And that's by comparison with finds published from Istanbul and other important sites. And what that's enabling us to do is to start to contextualize the churches in the landscape around. One of the questions that we have, of course, is whether the churches themselves already existed before the Kastro was constructed, or whether they were set in a landscape that was already well populated when the Kastro was brought into existence. This is Stephanos and Marathos, just to the south of the Kastro. The church is located here, or here. And you can see this is some of the first plots of results from field walking in the autumn or late summer last year. And these are this is a 100-meter square. So this is the plain of Marathos, and the edges of the mountain below. And you can see that the distribution of finds is definitely, we have finds concentrated in particular areas. And what the earliest analysis of this shows us is that, yes, around the church here we have material from late antiquity and the early Middle Ages. And we also have scatters of evidence of occupation from the Hellenistic period and the Roman period in the area to the south. But it's enabling us to start to plot out, to identify where people are living in these landscapes during the early Middle Ages, and to start to say that probably the settlements in the area around the churches, many of them, existed already before the Kastro was established. So the Kastro was established in a landscape that was already peopled. Well, this is Apalirou again, and we're now going to look at the mountainside below the Kastro, which is an area where an area to the west. Now, this is the plan by Knut and his colleagues from Oslo, and we're looking at this area to the west on the mountainside below, looking down from the Kastro here towards what we are kind of tentatively calling Katokoya. And we're talking about this area. It's a steep mountain, you can see, and it drops down before rising up to a low ridge, which then drops down to the plain beyond, and you can see that's the island of Paros in the distance. So here's Jim. Jim always looks quite adventurous, as you see. And this is my colleague Alex Turner from Newcastle University. And Jim and Alex particularly have been working to survey the remains of structures on the mountainside below the Kastro. You can see some of those structures in the photograph. Sometimes the remains of structures are reasonably well preserved, like this, which is the corner of a building, we think. The nature of the buildings is quite different to in the Kastro above, where it's mortared buildings. These are dry stone buildings without mortared structure on the whole, apart from some churches. We've identified a series of churches, possible churches, in the settlement below the Kastro. And it's interesting that the ceramics that we recovered from field walking in this area all belong to the period from the 7th to the 9th, possibly the early 10th century. Very little, well, no Roman material, and no later medieval material from this area either. It's also interesting that in this area, which is unenclosed, there's no fortification wall, as Jim said, we have the remains of a number of churches, which are probably then contemporary with the developing settlement on the mountainside below the Kastro. This is an example of one of those churches. This is looking east, so this is the apse of what we call the olive church, because it has a big olive tree growing on one corner of it. And it had a paraklesion constructed to the south, which also has an apse here. This is a planned view of that just from the laser scan. So this is one of 3 or 4 churches in that lower settlement. One of them still stands roofed, this church which is known as the Theoskepasti. It appears to be a post-medieval chapel when you look at it today, but in fact careful analysis of it shows that it has a significant amount of surviving Byzantine fabric, probably then of the early medieval period, of the 7th, 8th, 9th century period, including an apse which is set into the rock of the mountainside, and indeed the surviving vaulted roof, which is also, we think, medieval in date. So we can see there a landscape of settlement where we've got, in the plain below, settlements which are already existing, where churches are founded in late antiquity and in the early medieval period, and the settlement established on the mountaintop at the Kastro, and a new settlement on the mountainside below it. One final thing that we were interested in and have been working on in this area is agricultural features, especially terraces on the mountainside. On the mountain there are systems of terraces, which are a little bit difficult to see in this image. But for example, there's a system of check dam terraces running down this valley and turning here and running down the mountainside, and then you can see more terraces below. And our initial hypothesis was perhaps that these terraces might belong to the same period as the settlement in the village. So we tried to think of a way that we could address this problem and date terraces. They're notoriously difficult for archaeologists to date, but luckily, by chance, we've been collaborating with this adventurous fellow here. This is Tim Kinnaird from the University of St Andrews in Scotland. He is a geologist, environmental physicist, and he has been working in luminescence dating, especially optically stimulated luminescence dating. And before going to St Andrews, he worked at Suirk in Glasgow, in Scotland, where they had recently invented this instrument. So this instrument is a piece of equipment which is designed to test supermarket food to see if it's been exposed to too much radiation. But it's also useful for testing soil to see how much stored natural radiation it has. And that's basically the foundation of the luminescence dating method. And the reason this innovation is useful for us is because we can take it into the field and we can take small samples of soil for luminescence dating from a soil profile such as this. We can take many samples and we can analyze them in the field, and then we can decide where to put our optically stimulated luminescence dating sample. So this is a big advantage on traditional optically stimulated luminescence dating for two reasons. One, because we can choose where to put our dating sample much more, so we get a much better result, much more accurately. And two, because we can get a profile by correlating the profiling data with the absolute date from the OSL date. We can get a profile of the date at which the soil in a profile was buried, it built up. This is useful for especially agricultural features like terraces. Tim and I first worked on this, applied this method in Catalonia in northeastern Spain. But we've also tried it out in other places now, including here at Apalirou. So this is one of Tim's plots, which shows the kind of information we would expect with increasing age, with depth in the soil profile. But this was very interesting for us because it showed that the terraces were not early medieval in date, but instead they are late medieval in date. And we have no other evidence for late medieval occupation on that mountainside. And yet this whole terrace system, we tested 12 terraces going all the way up this valley, and they all belong. They were probably constructed around about 1200 AD. They were, the system was further developed about in the 14th century, and then it saw another phase of redevelopment in the 17th century. So that gives us, we were able to write a much more complicated history of the terraces here. But it also shows us that by doing this kind of work and the intensive field survey, we get different results from the different methods, and we get a much richer picture of the historic landscape over a long period of time than we would have just from using one technique or just from using the other. So those are our initial results so far, and we hope that it's producing a much richer picture of the settlement landscape around Apalirou. I'm going to hand over to Jim now, who is going to conclude for us.
Thank you very much to my colleagues who presented, I think, the meat of the argument, I hope, both in terms of what the Norwegian team has been able to document and begin to interpret from the Kastro, and also the research that Sam and I, between Newcastle and Edinburgh, have been able to do, looking at a much wider and longer term landscape history, giving us time depth. So we basically, with the Kastro, have what we see as particularly an event within the wider region in the southern end of Naxos, but we need to see it in a much greater picture, so that hopefully we've been able to demonstrate that. And then we have to think about why. Now, the answers are fairly straightforward. this is, as I said at the very beginning, this is a time of troubles. This is a time of when the Eastern Roman state was required to respond internally rather than externally. It was a state which no longer had, in a sense, it was no longer a territorial empire. It became an empire of coasts. And I think sometimes Byzantinists have tended to over-stress the significance of Anatolia and need to look at the seas which Constantinople was able to control, the Black Sea, the Aegean, and still many parts of the Mediterranean, you know, as far as the Balearic Islands up until the early 8th century. And we need then to see, obviously there is the new threat of the Arabs, but we also need to look at the evidence much more carefully, both the written evidence, and we're now beginning to get a much greater resolution, I hope, from surveys like this and from studies elsewhere about what's happening in this period in terms of the settlement evidence and the changing patterns of settlement evidence. There was an Arab fleet, and at this point I give a plug to the new publication which should be completed in terms of delivering it to the printers by the end of April, by the beginning of April, which the Norwegian Institute will be publishing. I've edited it with David Hill, which represents the conference that we held in Naxos in 2004. Within that is 2014. It's not that late. Sometimes I think it is, but it isn't. 2014. Within that is a paper by Paul Magdaleno, where he argues very cogently that the Arabs were concerned with conquering Constantinople, and it wasn't really until the capture of Crete and the attacks on Crete in the 8th and particularly in the 9th century that we should begin to see the more general pattern of raiding and threat within the Aegean. And so we need to think about Apalirou. What does it represent in the 7th and 8th centuries? What were the aims of the Byzantine state? And I think we have to recognise that we shouldn't necessarily be too easily taken in by texts. I say that as an archaeologist. This is a text which is often quoted, and it's by Leo the Deacon at the time of the Byzantine reconquest of Crete by Nikephoros Phokas. Isn't it that almost all the coastline is uninhabited as a result of the rapine? Most of the islands deserted because of these raids. I think what we've been able to demonstrate is that you need to read texts very carefully, you need to think about their audiences, and you also need to compare them very closely with the archaeological evidence, because certainly in Naxos this doesn't apply. Thank you very much.